In some form or another, storytelling has always been part of video games ever since their inception. Even Space War, the game generally considered to be the first real video game, could be seen as containing a narrative in some sense. You're a pilot in space locked in a battle with another pilot orbiting a star. I think it's important to note that narration as a concept is often misunderstood to be something narrower than it is. Most people consider narrative to just be a story within a text being directly communicated to the audience, but it actually often spans a broader space than one might initially think. Take Portal, for example. On the surface, the story is that you are a test subject, and the AI testing you eventually tries to kill you once tests are complete, at which point you evade her attempts to kill you until you blow her up at the end of the game. However, if the player chooses to analyse the set and prop design deeper, they'll find a story about how a research facility went from a morally ambiguous institution to a rundown empty space thanks to a rogue AI killing the staff with nerve gas, and a member of staff that survived by hiding in blind spots eating beans for months. In this case, the narration is the individual gameplay experience that a player has. In the first case, the player experiences narration through the progress of the story. They're told they'll be rewarded after Chamber 19, but are instead led into an incinerator. This clear dissonance between what the player hears and what they see leads to the addition of characterization, and reactive engagement in this story is the only way to progress. This is what is meant by narration. Simply put, the act of telling a story. Video games, however, are in the somewhat unique position of necessitating the player engagement to narrate. Unlike in film or literature, games require the player to make active choices in order to progress them. The narrative is dependent on the player. In this sense, it seems somewhat counterintuitive that games should have a measure of difficulty, since it could be feasibly argued that if a game wants to convey narrative, surely all difficulty does is obstruct pacing and in some cases the story even being told at all. However, I would argue that difficulty is usually a necessary component to video games as engagement of players. Oftentimes I find myself turned off from so-called narrative games because the description connotes an element of coasting, by which I mean progressing through a narrative already laid out by the developers without being presented any reason to. Like watching a film, the only agency the player is offered is allowing the events to continue playing out. This poses a difficult challenge for indie game developers, since often a large team is required to assemble a game with clear difficulty and opportunities for player agency, at least in terms of implementing it in gameplay. One recent circumvention of this issue is branching narrative games. A branching narrative game, as the name suggests, is one in which the player has the ability to make choices that impact the remaining narrative. In her 2017 essay Digital Storytelling and the Importance of Play, Amy Green writes about this concept of divergent narrative experiences in relation to 2016's Firewatch. Green writes that iterations of choice in digital storytelling eschew one fixed and consistent form, and goes on to say that the branching narratives that video games as a medium allow mean that they only become more narratively rich upon repeat playthroughs. Firewatch is a game in which the majority of the narrative is obscured to the player. Since the player can only carry out a certain amount of tasks during a single playthrough, the narrative will almost always omit information most would consider pivotal to understanding characters, simply because the player never triggered certain dialogue options. This is just one example of branching stories enriching narration in video games, and I believe that as game technologies progress, divergent stories will naturally become even more complex and allow for more and more player immersion until a wholly reactive world can be created on the basis of divergent narrative games.